There are only 12 hours left of 2024. I read a lot of books, a lot of great books, but one of the most exciting parts of the year is when you're planning out your reads for the following year. And that's what I'm doing. Here are 25 standalone books I want to read in 2025. I saw a few other booktubers doing this, and I have a TBR pile that is a mile long. So picking 25 books from that list was very difficult. I did a video similar to this halfway through 2024, 10 books to read before 2025. How did I do on that? I read 3 of them, so not very good, but that's because The Stand by Stephen King was on that list, and this book is a monster. I was reading this book for about 6 weeks on and off. I really binged the last 80% of it in 3 weeks, and that really slowed me down. The other massive book that was on my 10 books to read before 2025 was Blackwater by Michael McDowell. This was a masterpiece, but it's actually 6 short novels in disguise. So between these 2 books, that is 7 books that I've read. So really, I finished, 10 out of 17 books on that list, and that's not half bad. 4 books from that list are holdovers onto this list. I abandoned some of them. I'll read them sometime in the future, some far off time that I can't picture at this moment. But here are 25 standalones that are priority reads for me, and hopefully I do a lot better than I did this year. First on the list, we have Lonesome Dove. I don't know too much about this. All I've heard is that Mike from Mike's Book Reviews and every other booktuber that's picked this up in the last 18 months all say it is absolutely astounding. I have not read any Westerns before, but I look forward to reading this masterpiece. And I think if I start off my Western journey with this book, there's not really anywhere I can go that'll be better. And that's kind of daunting, but also kind of exciting. I know this is technically a book in a series, but they're all a set of collected standalones, so I don't really count that as a series. But hopefully I love Lonesome Dove like everyone else has loved it. So I'm starting off my Western journey by reading what many people consider to be one of the best Westerns of all time, and I'm here for it. I'm excited. Next, we have 11/22/63 by Stephen King. All of my friends that are fans of Stephen King tell me this is the best book he's ever written. They told me how they cried towards the end. They said how it's a time travel story where the time travel's not overly complicated or convoluted. They said it's one of Stephen King's best endings in a story. One of my main focuses for 2025 is the Dark Tower series. I'm not sure if there's any connections between this work and the Dark Tower, but this might end up being the only standalone Stephen King book I read in 2025 because I'll be reading at least, I'll be finishing The Dark Tower next year. But I look forward to tackling what many people consider to be Stephen King's best work because I've heard nothing but good things. Another book I've been hearing a lot of praise about is Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wong. I was torn between reading this or The Sword of Kaigen. But I decided on reading this one because, well, it's shorter, and I want to give myself a better chance of reading all the books on this list. And I really feel like when The Sword of Kagan first came out a few years ago, everyone was saying how amazing it is. But I've been seeing a lot of people who've been reading it more recently say that it really reads like a book that wasn't meant to be a standalone. And that worries me. So I'm going to read Blood Over Brighthaven first. The only thing I know about Blood Over Brighthaven is that there's a magical school at the center of it, and that's one of my favorite tropes. I loved it in the Book of the Ancestor trilogy by Mark Lawrence. I loved it in Percy Jackson and the Olympians. It's a very common trope in YA series, but I imagine it's going to be a little bit more grown up in this book, and I'm excited to give this a go early next year. The first holdover from 2024's list of standalones to read is Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. This is his American vampire novel that takes place on a riverboat. I didn't get around to reading the story of Abner Marsh and his misadventures with vampires, but I look forward to tackling this sometime in 2025. I have no interest in reading A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin because it's not going to ever be finished, and I'm not interested in tackling series that I'll never get catharsis from. But a nice vampire story, I love those. I look forward to reading Fever Dream soon. When I was in school, my major was political science. That's why I'm very excited to finally be getting around to reading Brave New World by Huxley. I know this is a dystopian story. I know it's written very well. It's very short. It's succinct. I know it's moving, very thought-provoking, philosophical. I've read some of Huxley's other works a long, long time ago. I know a lot of people consider this book to be very. Next, we have Ordinary Grace by William Kent Kruger. I've heard great things about this book from Brian from Belltube, Mike from Mike's Book Reviews, and everyone else from the Illuminati. I am very interested in this book. I've heard it's a tearjerker. I heard it's a great coming-of-age story. I know it takes place in Minnesota, and I know many of my favorite booktubers loved it. I think it even made it into Brian from Belltube's top 5 books of 2024. And that is high praise indeed. So I look forward to giving this book a try. I've never read anything from Kruger, but I've heard that this book and No Tender Land are masterpieces, and hopefully I love this one, and maybe I'll attack some of his other works later next year or the year after. Blake Crouch's Wayward Pine trilogy is one of my favorite series of all time, but those are the only books I've read from the author. That's why I'm very excited to be tackling Dark Matter. I've heard that this book is such a page-turner. Many people say it's one of the fastest reading books they've ever read. I don't know anything about the plot, and I want to go into the story as blind as possible because, Wayward Pines by Blake Crouch was full of so many plot twists. I had no idea where the story was going, and I think Blake Crouch has potential to become one of my favorite authors. He's already authored one of my favorite series. I'm sure his standalones will be just as good. I've heard nothing but great things about Dark Matter. In 2024, I've read 2 novels by John Williams. I read Stoner. It was a masterpiece. It is one of my favorite books of all time. I read that book, and I instantly knew that John Williams was going to be a favorite author for me. But then I realized he's only read 3 novels, and I've already read 2 of them, because I finished Butcher's Crossing 4 or 5 months ago, which was a Western. So I guess Lonesome Dove won't be the first Western I've ever read. Butcher's Crossing was a masterpiece. It was an amazing story. Moby Dick set in the American West. I originally read it because of Man Carrying Things. Very strong recommendation to read this book. But Butcher's Crossing wasn't my cup of tea. So maybe I'll feel better about John Williams's 3rd novel, Augustus. This is a historical fiction about Augustus, Caesar Augustus of Rome, and I love the Roman Empire. I'm a dude. I think about the Roman Empire at least once a day, and I've heard Augustus is one of the best works of historical fiction around. And John Williams, even though he's only written 3 novels, his range is astounding. Stoner's one of the great academic novels. Butcher's Crossing is a great Western, and I've heard that this is a great historical fiction. I'll just be sad that when I finish every book from John Williams because he really is an amazing, phenomenal writer. The next book I added to my TBR as soon as I saw a video about it from John Douglas, who has a YouTube channel. I'll link all the YouTube channels I mentioned in the description below. But Sledge versus the Labyrinth was pitched to me as a modern-day Conan the Barbarian. I loved the Conan movies when I was younger. I was watching them when I was 9, which is perhaps too young to be watching those movies. I have not read the books, but I'm in the mood for a nice action story. A nice story where I don't have to think too much. I just get to watch an awesome protagonist beat up bad guys. John Wick meets Taken, and that's quite a compelling thing. Can't wait to see how action-packed and exciting this read is. And, thanks to John Douglas for putting this on my radar. Next, we have a modern-day classic, Life of Pi by Jan Martel. I've heard this book is amazing. I watched the movie, but I don't really remember anything about it. I know there's something about a boy on a boat or a canoe, and there's a tiger, and they're going to different islands, and things are happening. So kind of Gulliver's Travels-esque. But I've heard there's a lot of interesting commentary about religion and spirituality and growing up and coming of age. And I love tigers. And the cover is quite compelling. Got a little man cowering next to a tiger. So I'm pretty sure some weird things are going to happen. I've heard this can be a bit of a tearjerker. I've heard that it's an amazing book. I know President Obama loved it. I know a lot of my friends who read it in high school loved it, but I know very little about it. The next book on the list has been on my radar for a few months now because Will and Ed from the Brothers Gwynne speak so highly about it. They both rated this book 5 stars, and I'm talking about Glorious Exploits. I've heard this is a great work of historical fiction. I know it touches on a lot of themes about oppression and captivity and taking advantage of prisoners. And I think a part of the plot, if I'm remembering correctly, is a bunch of people are forcing Athenian prisoners to act out a play before they die, and that's quite a compelling read. The next two books on this list are from author Robert McCammon, Boy's Life and Swan Song. Both of these books are very highly rated here on Booktube. Both of these are considered masterpieces of Southern Gothic literature. And after reading Blackwater by Michael McDowell, I know Southern Gothic is one of my favorite subgenres. I know Swan Song is a post-apocalyptic novel, and I know Boy's Life is a coming-of-age Southern Gothic. That's all I know about both these books, because I try to avoid getting as much information about reads so I can go into them blind. So I look forward to giving McCammon a try. Sometime, probably in the beginning of the second quarter of 2025. A Boy's Life was on my list of 10 books to read this year, but because of the stand in Blackwater, I never got around to it. And I'm happy to finally be fixing that. I love weird books. I love absolute fever dreams. I love stories that I can't predict, stories of strange premises that I would never write myself, that I can never come up with. And I heard that The Hike by Drew Magary is one such book. All I know is that our protagonist walks off into a forest or something, goes on this hike, and he goes on a grand, strange adventure. My wife almost got this book for me for Christmas, but then she got scared because she's never sure what books I've already read, so we're reading this book together. I look forward to Buddy reading this book with my wife. I've heard it's very strange. I can't wait to talk to people about it. The next book is from author Kim Stanley Robinson, which is one of the most successful science fiction authors of the last 50 years. The Years of Rice and Salt has been on my TBR for about 5 years. It holds the distinction of being the book that's been on my TBR for the longest amount of time. I know it's an alternate history story with reincarnation as a major theme and plot device. I know very little about it, but I remember reading the synopsis 5 years ago and being like, I'm going to read that. I want to read that story. It was on my list of 10 standalones to read in 2024, but I never got around to it. And I can't wait to read this in next year in 2025. One of my favorite booktubers is Jimmy Nuts from the Fantasy Nuttwork. I was watching his live stream yesterday or the day before, and he was talking about a lot of his favorite reads from 2024. And he mentioned this one book by Kazuo Ishiguro, and I instantly decided to add it into the 2025 TBR pile. And that book is The Remains of the Day. Ishiguro has been on the agenda for several years, and originally, up until about 6 hours ago, Clara and the Sun was on this list. But when I heard Jimmy say that this book is a great counter-argument to Stoner by John Williams, I had to read it. And I have to read this book rather quickly because I want to know why it's a great counter-argument to Stoner. I love Stoner. I read it and it instantly became one of my favorite books of all time. I've heard nothing but great things about Ishiguro, and I look forward to reading this book and comparing it to Stoner by John Williams and talking to Jimmy about it, because that's quite a compelling pitch for me, especially considering how much I loved Stoner. After I read Blackwater, I realized I love family sagas. So I went to Reddit, which is my number one source for finding book recommendations besides BookTube. And I was looking for books like Blackwater. And this book by Philip Meyer, titled The Sun, was instantly put on my radar. I know it takes place in the American West or South. It follows a family over many years. I know it's recently been, turned into a TV show, but I know very little about it. All I know is that it follows a family across many years. It's a Western. I believe it takes place in Texas or something like that. I'm not sure I'll ever read a book that captures the same magic as Blackwater. But one of the main things that made Blackwater such a great read, that made it my favorite read ever, was just watching all these characters grow up from childhood to old age, seeing these old people pass away, raise up their grandchildren, seeing how a family changes across the decades. That is so compelling. Because I believe if you went into the history of any of our families, there are some great dramas in that storyline. So I look forward to reading The Sun by Philip Meyer. I've heard that it's not similar to Blackwater in terms of tone, but in terms of following a family over many decades and the great character development, this book I heard is a pretty decent match, but I'll return and report after I finish this one. It's been several years since I've read anything from C.S. Lewis. I love the Chronicles of Narnia. I love the first installment in the Space Trilogy. I have to get back to that trilogy one day. I've read C.S. Lewis's apologetics works, but I have yet to read the Screwtape Letters. This is an epistolatory novel told from the point of view of a devil whose job is to try to tempt people and turn them to evil here on Earth. It's considered one of the great works of Christian literature. It's a short book. And how many books that are on this list? I'm glad there are some short books on here. It's been too long since I've read C.S. Lewis. He nourishes my soul. And I can't wait to read the Screwtape Letters because I've owned this book for about 10 years and I've yet to even give it a try. Another holdover from 2024, Nation by Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett is best known for his Discworld series, which is over 40 books. But many people who've read Nation consider it to be Terry Pratchett's best book. Even the author said it was his best work, and that is high praise indeed. I've liked everything I've read in Discworld, and I've absolutely loved many of the installments so far. I think I've read 9 or 10 of them. But I look forward to reading Nation. I know it follows a young man and a young girl. The world has just been destroyed in something, and they're trying to find their way to each other across the world. I've heard this is a tearjerker. I heard that this will hit me in the feels, and I'm all for it. This is another holdover from 2024, and I'm reading it. Reading this early next year. Next, we have 2 more works of classic science fiction. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke and Electric Forest by Tana Flee. I heard about Electric Forest from Rachel from The Shades of Orange, and I know that Mike from Mike's Book Review really liked Childhood's End. I don't remember much about either of these plots, but they were on my radar. I put them on the list for a reason. I just don't remember why. And I own both these books. I'm going to be reading them because I want to get more experience with classic science fiction from longer than the last 30 years, and both these books fit the bill. I'm excited to finally be reading The Martian by Andy Weir. I loved the movie, and usually I never read books after I've watched the movie. But it's been enough time. I think it's been about 6 years since I watched the movie, and I've heard the book is amazing. Andy Weir gets a lot of love here. I'm not as experienced when it comes to science fiction as I am when it comes to fantasy. I think I've read less than 25 science fiction novels, and I look forward to reading The Martian. I've heard it's a good time. Next, we have a post-apocalyptic classic, The Postman by David Brin. I've heard this is a very optimistic post-apocalyptic novel, and I haven't really read any post-apocalyptic stories that were optimistic, but I'm here for it. I'm interested in it. I've heard this book is about the strength of the American spirit. It follows a protagonist, from my understanding, that's acting like the last postman. He's traveling through America, delivering messages, doing good deeds. So I think this can be kind of interesting. I've heard that this book is hit or miss. Modern audiences don't react as strongly as people did when this book first came out, but I'm looking forward to reading The Postman. It's short and sweet. I think I could read it in probably a day and a half, and I'm excited about it. Next, we have another work of post-apocalyptic fiction, Earth Abides by George R. Stewart. This follows a protagonist in Berkeley, California, and a bunch of people in the world have been wiped out by a virus, very similar to Stephen King's The Stand. I really love the premise of The Stand, even though I'm not the biggest fan of the execution or the bloat that is The Stand. I've heard Earth Abides talks a lot about the same types of themes and subject matter, and I'm excited to read it. I've heard this is a more succinct literary version of The Stand. 2 years ago, I read this book, The Night Always Comes by Willie Vlotton, and I absolutely loved it, but I have yet to read anything else from the author. So I decided to read his most recent book, The Horse. This book is depressing. It follows a grumpy old man who lives alone, and Willie Vlotton, he writes desperate, lonely, tragic, damaged characters like no one else. His book, The Night Always Comes, absolutely wrecked me. It was one of my favorite books of 2022. And I look forward to reading The Horse. I know nothing about it, but I'm excited for it. I started reading some Ray Bradbury in 2024. I've read about a dozen of his short stories, and I've read his book, Zen and the Art of Writing. And it was very thought-provoking. It was very interesting to see, like, a glimpse into his creative process. But I look forward to reading his book, Something Wicked This Way Comes. All I know is that this book follows, like, a circus of some sort that comes out at night. I've heard that this book is considered a masterpiece. I love Ray Bradbury's writing. I loved his short story, Pumpernickel. I loved his other short stories. Dear Santa was probably the only short story I've read from him that I did not enjoy. I look forward to reading Something Wicked This Way Comes. So there you have it. 25 books I want to read in 2025. I think I have a very eclectic bunch of stories. We got science fiction, we got fantasy, we got thrillers, we got post-apocalyptic, we got Southern Gothic, we got vampires, and I think a flexible TBR filled with a very eclectic mix of books is the way to go. No matter how I'm feeling next year, one of these books is going to match the mood, and I'm excited for it. I look forward to seeing what the stories have in store for me in 2025. I look forward to seeing how these books change me as a person next year, because every book you read is another lifetime lived. If any of these books sound interesting to me, make sure to subscribe to the channel, follow me along. I do weekly vlogs. I use the community tab, or at least I plan on using it a lot more, keeping everybody updated. And I think 2025 is going to be the best reading year of my life. That's what I'm speaking into existence. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next year.